and some of the patents that are utilized to create those, to transmit them over social media networks and all kinds of things. There's a lot of new viewers coming to Crowdsource the Truth, David, because I've been doing these, walkarounds in New York City while we're under this lockdown from the viral pandemic. Oh no, why isn't it playing live? What's going on? I have been seeing reports that the internet is somehow slowing down. There it is. So maybe that's happening. I don't know. But David, you've told us about SERCO, the biggest company that nobody's ever heard of, that started out as RCA GB 1929, the UK version of the Radio Corporation of America, that I don't know if people realize the far-reaching capabilities that group has, but I think we should go over that ground just a bit and talk about how this BBC pandemic documentary sort of modeled in certain ways what's happening with the coronavirus spread. And I know you want to talk about how the results of a simulation, when they differ from reality, cause us to have to change the simulation rather than reality, right?
Oh, absolutely vital. And I have I guess, the gift, if you will, of 40 years experience of this, going back to when I worked for Schlumberger as the coordinator of artificial intelligence and geoscience research at the Ridgefield Research Center in Connecticut. And so right back, well, it's nearly 40 years ago now, I've always been intrigued by the difference between humans modeling or simulating in their minds what they think is true and comparing it with reality or empirical data coming from the world, which you really shouldn't be messing with, because that's what the world is telling you. Even if the instruments measuring are miscalibrated, you can always back that out. But fake news and false theories can put the world into a tailspin. And in my belief, this pandemic, which is spreading around the world and panicking sovereign states and so on, where the assumption being made, and you mentioned the documentary, Contagion, ! Produced by the BBC. I think that's an outstandingly persuasive and brilliant professional performance by the BBC, and I have great admiration for the people within the BBC. But what's intriguing, and I think people, in order to understand where we're coming from, they need to watch that documentary, and maybe do a little bit of research into the origins, as you mentioned, of SERCO, because going back to RCA GB 1929, that was rather an important year for the world, because it was the crash of the stock market in New York, where people threw themselves out of the window and perhaps didn't realize that in 1929, the only surviving chapter of an organization, a secret society, Kappa Beta Phi, was established in New York in 1929. And fast forward to the present, it has some extremely powerful people who are members, including Michael Bloomberg and Wilbur Ross and Larry Fink, the chief executive officer of the world's largest shadow banker, BlackRock Inc. So going back to 1929, this was obviously pre-war, interesting decade. The BBC, I think, had been formed in 1924, something like that. And 5 years after, there would be a commission of a really interesting statue outside Broadcasting House, which you and I were privileged to film and talk about, by a man called Eric Gill, which shows, I think it's Prospero and Theseus. I'm not sure that's the right term.
Ariel was the kid's name, no?
Oh, yes, Prospero and Ariel. And that's an extraordinary statue, because it shows a sexualized naked boy Christ on a crucifix. At least that's what I judge to be the fact.
No, wait, aren't we conflating two? There's the one in the front with Prospero and Ariel, and then the one on the side had the characters grabbing at that Christ. What, right?
You're right. You got a great eye for detail. Okay, and there's a book held to his private parts. That's the sexualized naked Christ, with the phrase "obsculta," on it. And one of our listeners very kindly wrote in with an interpretation of what that meant. And apparently it's from the Benedictine Creed, listen and obey, which I think is a great metaphor for what the BBC is telling us to do right now. Basically, the BBC is channeling what I would describe as propaganda and fake news and a fake theory into the minds, collective minds of the public. And of course, that's not negligible importance, because this is the largest broadcaster in terms of payroll in the world. And it broadcasts in 20 languages. And if it says there's a pandemic spreading around the world in 20 languages, which reaches an audience of, let's say, 200 million by the end of the day, then the public at large is convinced that there is a global pandemic spreading around the world by an implied vector, and perhaps we can come to that word a little later, of what is known as patient zero. So anyone who cares to watch the BBC's Discovery ! Documentary, which I think is absolutely brilliant, it's an hour and 14 minutes long, will see there is a woman by the name of Dr. Hannah Fry, who is the presenter and plays the role, it's a live action role play essentially, of a patient zero in a little town called Hazelmere in the United Kingdom, in southern England. So she goes through a routine where there's a mathematician up at Queen's College, Cambridge, where you and I were in January, by the name of Dr. Stephen Kissler, who's obviously a brilliant individual, who puts together a set of algorithms that model the assumptions of Dr. Hannah Fry that are made in that documentary. And then he and she and the BBC show the spread of the virus into Hazelmere and then around the country with 6,000 volunteers that result from a digital virus being planted in that cell phone that she's holding up. I think it's called the BBC Pandemic app. And then any one of the volunteers who carries the equivalent of that machine that comes into Dr. Hannah Fry's contact or proximity for a certain period of time is deemed by the computer to have become infected. And then it's fascinating. You see the growth of the pandemic from Hazelmere and ultimately for the simulation into the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. And it's very impressive and very persuasive if you believe in the assumption that the spread is based on a patient zero. Now, I have this 40-year background in simulation and ground truthing and testing with a feedback loop through an invention of mine called the deductive computing machine, whether or not your theory is consistent with the data empirically derived from, in the case of Wuhan City, whether or not that's an appropriate assumption to make that this is due or this spread is due to a patient zero. And what I'm saying is the hotspot, and I'm not an epidemiologist, you're probably going to correct my pronunciation because I struggle with that at 76, but anyway, it's near enough. It's not consistent with a hotspot because Dr. Hannah Fry's pandemic, if you will, spread outwards from the trip she made in Hazelmere to the gym and the pub, etc. So the density goes out and you get hotspots, created in Edinburgh and Manchester and Birmingham. But Wuhan City is different. And I have reason to believe that New York City is also different. So I'm going to propose a theory, and I think you remember that you'd often said to me, let's not discuss this stuff until it's on the show. So you and I might be jointly surprised with the audience, perhaps to do a little discovery in real time. So I'm going to make a hypothesis. To my horror, I discovered that the prisoner blood program, and I discovered it today, was initiated in the 1970s in Arkansas by physicians at the University of Arkansas Medical Center campus or Medical Services campus in the 1970s. And it suddenly occurred to me, if one or two of those physicians at the University of Arkansas Medical Services Center were so minded to explore the possibility of eugenic control of the population, wouldn't it be interesting if they helped to develop a combination of virus and vaccine to inject prisoners in the Arkansas correction system and ultimately develop a tainted blood industry or business, aided and abetted by the Clintons when he was appointed or elected governor of Arkansas, and take it through to his arrival in Washington, D.C. as President of the United States in 1993, where the last shipment of tainted blood or blood from the Arkansas correction system was in 1994, leaving the business, let's assume, and I'm hypothesizing here, an international business selling a protection package to cities and states and provinces, whereby if you don't pay your population tax, or maybe euphemistically you could call it your carbon footprint tax, then you get visited with a pandemic, which can bring you, your city, your province, and your region to its knees, handing power over to. Now, Nathaniel Meyer Rothschild is quoted, although there is some difficulty in finding the origin of that quote or whether it's authentic. He said, "I care not what laws are passed in the British Empire, just give me control of the money supply." Now, if I understand correctly, your Congress and your Senate and your president are busy putting together a money supply package to maintain liquidity for the people who are about to lose their jobs or the small businesses that are going bankrupt.
Well,
And
I
the
think
warning,
it might be more focused on their giant corporate friends than it is the people who are losing their jobs, but your point is taken.
well, yeah, but let's just go ahead with that because the borrower is always the servant of the lender, right? Now, where would, I don't know, I've heard the sum $5 trillion is going to be released into the economy to maintain, well, the level of employment or, the corporate friends in the state that they've got used to. Either way, it's a huge amount of money and it's borrowed from someone. Now, what organizations are capable of providing a line of credit of that order? Well, there are very few, but one of them is the secret societies you and I love to talk about that were formed in 1776, Phi Beta Kappa and Kappa Beta Phi, where I discovered a few days ago or weeks ago the key to Kappa Beta Phi given to David Rockefeller, who in 1991 said something to the effect the world is ready to move to a supranational government of an intellectual elite and world bankers. Well, Jason, aren't we heading that way like right now? Over to you.
I mean, I think we're in it because we've got Steve Mnuchin, who is a member of the Skull and Bones, and also, what is he part of? Goldman Sachs or some giant, investment company, bank kind of thing. And it's interesting when you look at the pictures of Trump's coronavirus task force, the ones that have Steve Mnuchin in them, he looks delighted. It doesn't seem like coronavirus is bothering him too much. He's kind of standing in the background with a smile. He seems sort of unable to control his glee. This might not be the best example of it, but he looks like he's holding back a smile to me. He looks like a Muppet or something. But I saw a picture where he's standing in the background kind of always delighted because there's trillions flying around. I should have had it ready, but I don't know, David. I don't trust these members of the Skull and Bones. I don't really trust any members of secret societies. Obviously, there's personal information that people want to keep secret, but I don't think these guys in the government should be having an affiliation with some higher loyalty than the Constitution and their service to the people of the United States.
I totally agree with you. Now, so let's go back along that history line. Now we know that SERCO was formed out of RCAGB 1929, which had the contract to provide the British peasant with the 4-minute early warning of an intercontinental ballistic missile attack from the Soviet Union. And of course, if you were a peasant, I think you stood a pretty good chance of getting fried, while SERCO, then RCAGB 1929, might be busy forming an intellectual elite and bankers to take refuge in bunkers underneath the great 4-star or 5-star hotels around the world so they might survive. But fast forward. So in 1978, it appears that the physicians of the University of Arkansas Medical Services Center handed over the program to Bill Clinton and his cronies in the Arkansas Correction Institute or Department or whatever it is. And so they transferred the tainted blood program from a university-based operation to what I would suggest is a prison-based criminal organization embedded ultimately by 1994 within the United States Department of Justice. Because in 1994, the United States Department of Justice took over or integrated the transport program of the Bureau of Prisons and the United States Department of Justice Conair program into JPATS, or Justice Prisoner Alien Transportation System. And because 1994 was the last year of a shipment of blood from the Arkansas Correction System, I would argue that a criminal organization, possibly operating a global protection racket, where cities and states and provinces would be threatened with a pandemic or a flu outbreak or HIV or AIDS, unless they paid carbon taxes. I don't know when carbon taxes precisely came in, but the concept of depopulating the planet on the basis they're producing, or we, you human beings and mammals, are producing too much carbon dioxide, was born pretty early in the 1980s by people like Maurice Strong. Oh, yeah, there you have the Cray twins. Now,
well, the
Cray
reason I
twins,
wanted to show the audience the Cray twins, David, is because a lot of people might hear the statement that you just made and feel like it sounds far-fetched or perhaps outrageous. But this concept of a protection racket, an enforcement company or something within a prison was founded by the Cray twins, wasn't it?
well, and their mentor, a guy called Bert Rossi, right, who was born in 1922 and died in 2017. So the old bastard, he had a good run at 95 years, but he was the interface between the 5 families in the United States and the Cray twins, who had been locked up in 1969 for life imprisonment for the murder of one of their fellow honchos, who'd called, I think, Ronnie Cray or Reggie Cray a fat poof, right, which is slang for a homosexual, right?
Wow.
Okay. Anyway, the guy got shot, right? And the
Not
Crays
surprising.
went ultimately to jail for life. But now here is the extent to which potentially a prison-based protection racket can extort concessions from terrified guards or the families of terrified guards, because there was a young lad called Brad Lane, I think it was, who was, I think, 14 years old and became a pen pal of one of the Cray twins. And I believe the prison system allowed Brad Lane at 14 years old to spend the night in the jail with one of those twins, right? So you have a pedophile, homosexual, criminal organization operated from within Her Majesty's prison system. Now, it appears that that model got transferred to the United States,
It's an astounding piece of
including, for
information,
example,
David. I mean, you can almost not imagine that the parents or any sensible adult would allow a 14-year-old kid to stay in a prison with somebody who's not his father.
totally, right? It's a level, see, and coming back to that idea that the prison system in Arkansas pioneered with the help of the University of Arkansas Medical Services Center physicians, the idea of taking blood from prisoners infected with, I don't know, AIDS or Hep C or whatever it was, turning it into a plasma. So they buy it in at $7 a pint and they sell it on into Canada to be processed at a laboratory called Connaught Laboratories into a plasma and sold on at $50 a pint into countries like the Congo or South Africa to create a pandemic of AIDS and Hep C amongst targeted populations in Africa and veterans in the United States and Canada who got
Whoop. There's that.
symptoms,
Sorry, we lost you there for a second, David. So it was veterans who got what?
Hep C or AIDS from this tainted blood racket. Now, I would argue anyway that their remedy is a wrongful death, but let's just keep going on with the timeline. So in 1994, Bill Clinton has been in office as president of the United States for a year, but the tainted blood supply from Arkansas has dried up, presumably because he's been exposed. So someone like Clinton or the Clintons would say, well, how do we maintain this trade? Because it's very lucrative, you know, going from $7 a pint up to $50 a pint. It's pretty good margin, right? Okay, so here is a possibility. They decided, well, if we could run a criminal racket in, let's say, Vancouver, BC, where we could get blood from a similar community by, let's say, taking prostitutes from the downtown east side and killing them and extracting their blood, maybe that would be a useful source of infection to develop the vaccines necessary to protect people from those infections, right? And I'm going fast forward to Starnet at 425 Carroll Street, where you and I think we did a very good documentary. But fast forward to the Contagion exclamation mark documentary put by the BBC. Through no fault of their own, I believe, Dr. Hannah Fry and Dr. Stefan Kissler, the mathematician up at Cambridge who put together the template of algorithms to do the simulation, they started and stayed with an assumption that this kind of pandemic or epidemic would be spread by a patient zero. And I'm alleging it's much more likely that they formed a Con Air SWAT team of vaccinated carriers of the virus to go into certain targeted communities to extort protection money. And so why wouldn't we look at the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg, where there was a woman, a Chinese-born woman, who was escorted off the premises by the RCMP, who I think at that time, the intelligence director of the RCMP, one Cameron Ortis, was suspected of selling or providing secrets to the enemies, if you will, of the Five Eyes countries through a phone network named Phantom Secure.
Yeah.
Which was a BlackBerry-based operation where the hardware, and I think did you want to just give me or give the listeners a little insight onto what you told me about your understanding of the hardware associated with Phantom Secure and the possibility that Hillary Clinton was using it? Over to you.
Yeah, I think this is very important, David, because actually, even since you and I spoke about it, whether it was yesterday or the day before, something else has happened. I don't want to use this guy's full name because I don't want to promote his nonsense or provoke him to initiate a lawsuit of some kind. First of all, this is Cameron Ortis. You told me about him. He was the civilian intelligence director of the RCMP, who's now in prison, as you said, for stealing secrets and transmitting information through an encrypted computer network. Now, Phantom Secure, you're the first person who told me about Phantom Secure, and I believe you learned about it because the FBI took them out of business. They basically were modifying the hardware of BlackBerries to offer their customers the service of encrypted communication. Now, this is just a theory by me. We would need to know more about how this hardware encryption in the BlackBerry works, but modifying consumer electronics is actually something that I have a fair deal of experience with. When I was the CEO of 21st Century 3D, we created a stereoscopic video camera called the 3D VX. And this was based on a Panasonic DVX100 camcorder that myself and my colleagues basically dissected and put back together in the form of a 3D camera. So we cut the thing in half and, tapped into certain specific components that were useful for what we wanted, but we had to design this custom circuit that allowed both cameras to be driven off of the oscillator chip of one. So we bypassed the oscillator chip in the second camera, and they were both going on the same clock, basically, David, because timing is extremely important in all of these sophisticated operations, and certainly in video recording. To have the two cameras perfectly in sync, they needed to use one chip. So we developed a circuit that allowed this to happen, to communicate between the two cameras in a way that Panasonic never intended them to do. But it took us a lot of time. It took 2-3 years of development to make all the different hardware that was associated with this thing. And during the course of that time, Panasonic had come out with a new camera, and it was becoming difficult to get these DVX100 cameras, and it was not feasible to redo our development of our custom hardware. And so we went to eBay to purchase a lot of these discontinued Panasonic cameras. And for a long time, we've heard the story that Hillary Clinton was buying Blackberries off of eBay. This never really made sense to me, David, because I think everybody knows that Hillary Clinton has a lot of money, and she was the Secretary of State at the time. So why would Hillary Clinton purchase a used Blackberry from eBay when she could buy any Blackberry that she wants? Well, it does stand to reason that if these guys at Phantom Secure had developed a hardware encryption system that involved modifying the Blackberries, it's very likely that it was only going to work in a certain model or select models of Blackberries. And if you just bought the newest one, it may not work. This would be one possible reason why Hillary Clinton would purchase Blackberries from eBay. She might have wanted a specific model that perhaps was no longer available new. That makes a lot of sense to me. The other thing is, we heard that when Hillary Clinton and some of her associates got in trouble and began being investigated by the FBI, that they smashed these Blackberries with hammers. This guy, George, who I'm thinking about, who's a pathological liar in my experience and frequently spreading fake news and making up nonsense theories to get people in trouble and to gain views on his channel, he's come under heavy scrutiny in the past few days for putting out a story that a U.S. cyclist who was in those military games in Wuhan was patient zero. But now you're presenting a countermanding theory that says the spread of the virus doesn't match the model of a patient zero spread. And the same guy for 3 years has been pushing a story with some evidence, but maybe not conclusive evidence, that Imran Awan was hacking and reprogramming Blackberries. And it occurs to me, David, if somebody like Phantom Secure didn't want the FBI to find out that they were doing all this criminal activity, hacking Blackberries to allow people to conduct business in the areas of money laundering and drug trafficking and human trafficking, it might make sense to have a patsy, somebody like Imran Awan, who some idiot on the internet like this guy George could spend a lot of time getting people focusing on this guy, who, by the way, the FBI or the Washington, D.C. Metro PD arrested him in the airport for bank fraud, and he went through a trial and everything, basically got a slap on the wrist, and he signed a plea deal which absolved him of any crimes he's done for his whole entire life up until the day of that trial. So it's interesting, David. I can't say for sure if what we're talking about right now is in fact what happened, but there's a lot of sensible explanations as to why it might have actually been Phantom Secure that was providing these Blackberries to the criminal elements that we're discussing. And perhaps Imran Awan had nothing to do about it, because the smashing of the Blackberries with hammers would not necessarily destroy all the data on them. Hillary Clinton is very adept at destroying data. We've heard many, many stories about how BleachBit was used. BleachBit, David, is a bit-level erasure tool. We all know that computers use a binary system to store data. They're recording either a 1 or a 0. And when you delete something from your computer, it doesn't actually erase it like with a pencil. It just sort of puts it over here and says, okay, if we need to store something else, we can write it over this. But when you do a bit-level erase, the computer goes through every 1 and every 0 in the storage device and just sets it to 0. It erases everything on it in an unrecoverable way. When you take a device like a BlackBerry, which contains solid-state memory, something called NAND, non-volatile RAM, you could smash an NAND chip. And the way they work, they're in these sort of small cells such that a forensic digital laboratory like those run by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies could actually extract data from segments of the chip, even if it was substantially smashed. So I don't think Hillary Clinton would smash the BlackBerry necessarily. She probably would seek to do a bit-level erase, unless there's a special chip inside the BlackBerry that is required to decrypt the data. Now, I don't know all the details of how this phantom secure technology worked, but if what we're saying is correct, and the chip was unique to the phone and specifically required to decrypt the data on the hard drive, perhaps it was extremely difficult to decrypt, or perhaps next to mathematically impossible to decrypt if that chip were destroyed. So it's my hypothesis, David, that the smashing of the BlackBerries was done to destroy a chip that was placed inside the BlackBerry, not the storage memory.
Well, I think, this is a fascinating line of inquiry. It's discovery on the fly that we're sharing with our audience, and I hope they find it as fascinating as I do. Anyway, moving forward, let's hypothesize that there is a global vaccinated viral protection racket in operation where crime bosses, both in jail and outside the jail, have got these advanced secure communications network like Phantom Secure, and they're in a position to extort cities or provinces or states into paying what effectively is protection money against global warming. Now, global warming, as driven or hypothesized by the anthropogenic carbon dioxide gas generated by human, is scientific nonsense, right? It's just impossible to relate a phenomena involving a trace gas, which is basically, I call it God's gas because carbon dioxide is a fertilizer gas that makes the plants green. You can't translate that and human production of it in trace quantities into a principal component of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming. But from a point of view of a racket, of course, it's very, very profitable to tax people for breathing out, which is what they're doing.
It's sort of a necessity.
Well, exactly. So actually, just to give you a flavor, the amount of anthropogenic carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 18 parts per million, about 0.0018%. So it's immeasurably small. When you breathe it out, you breathe out at 40,000 parts per million. So you violate the Obama cap. Now, when I say Obama cap, just to remind, or maybe people didn't know, that the back office of Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, which actually allows whoever's operating it to monitor the behavior of every citizen in the United States and their eligibility for Medicare, was outsourced to SERCO with a contract for $1.2 billion, which gives SERCO the ability to track, let's say, disposable members of society who might need a little eugenic treatment at the hands of a dirty needle. But I digress. So let's just go back to picking up from where, let's say, BBC left off. So I'd like to compliment the BBC and everyone involved in that production of Discovery, exclamation mark. I've written an open letter.
Pandemic, exclamation mark.
Yes. Contagion, exclamation mark. Yes. Open letter to Sir David Cecil Clementi, who is chairman of the BBC board. So people can find that on my Patreon site. I'll just read out his background because it's very germane to what I'm proposing. So he is chairman of the BBC board, the governing board of the British Broadcasting Corporation. He's former deputy governor of the Bank of England, former chairman of Prudential PLC. Now, Prudential is an interesting company because it's a shareholder in SERCO. So my presumption is that Prudential sent a representative to the SERCO shareholders meeting on the 47th floor of the World Trade Center building number 1 in New York on 9/11. He is the former chairman of Virgin Money, interesting title, and former master of the Mercers Company, the oldest senior Mercers guild in the City of London. And his father, Cresswell Clementi, was master in 1977. So what I'm asking Sir David Cecil Clementi to do is consider, just making a suggestion, bringing back my friend with his board, Greg Dyke, who was the former Director General of the BBC, who I believe would be a very powerful champion of a Mark II version of Contagion ! Where instead of Dr. Hannah Fry acting as presenter and patient zero in Haslemere, England, someone in New York, and you probably see where I'm going here, could act as a presenter and patient zero in New York to see if the patient zero model describes what is happening into New York. My understanding is you've gone to several places where if this pandemic was real in New York, you would certainly expect to see certain things outside certain hospitals. Maybe you could just touch on what you've encountered in your fascinating walks around the city of New York when you tried to go to check out the news that you're getting about wards being full of people who can't get access to ventilators. Over to you.
Well, there was a story in the New York Times that a lot of people saw, David. It went around the world. I saw it was republished by the Daily Mail and several other newspapers in the United States and elsewhere, saying that this doctor at the Elmhurst Hospital Center in Queens, which is an ambulance driver, told me only about a 13-minute drive from New York Presbyterian Hospital, which is downtown by the MCC, where people became familiar with that after Jeffrey Epstein popped out. But basically, the New York Times showed us this hospital, and there was a huge crowd of people standing in a line. It looked like a real disaster. We got these tents outside and tons of people. There was a doctor, made a very dramatic video saying that they were low on equipment, particularly these life-saving ventilators, and that it was like an apocalypse inside there. She was violating HIPAA laws by video recording inside the ER or the ICU or something like that. Certainly no video recording is allowed inside the hospital. I've spoken to several MDs about this, and they were about as shocked as anybody could be. It's a totally unprofessional and unacceptable thing to do. Oh, and this is the important part, is that she said that they were running out of ventilators. But according to the New York Times' own video, the head of New York City Public Hospitals denied that Elmhurst Hospital Center had ever come close to running out of ventilators. So to me, David, this is a de facto representation of artificial reality, because either the hospital is trying to create an artificial reality by denying this lack of respirators, and I don't know why they would do that. Maybe they want to try to keep people calm, or the doctor or the New York Times are lying by saying there are none. The real strange thing, David, is that if the New York Times publishes this video where the doctor says there are no respirators, and then they find out there are respirators, this video is not retracted. They put it right in there. Like the other day, I published a video where I was doubting a similar kind of story that was put out by the New York Post. The New York Post told us that members of the military were constructing a makeshift morgue outside of Bellevue Hospital. So I went over there, and there was nothing going on at Bellevue Hospital. 4 or 5 blocks up the street, at a totally different hospital at NYU Langone Medical Center. That's where they were building this, but when I asked the commanding officer on site, he would not confirm or deny if they were building a morgue. He just gave me the phone number of a public information officer that he suggested I contact, because understandably, this guy is given his orders and they do not include talking to me. So what I did was, instead of calling this Army PIO, I had the phone number for the New York City Medical Examiner's Office public information officer. I had been communicating with them when the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing happened, and they were actually quite helpful and professional. And what they did was they gave me the official statement. This woman, her job is to speak to the press on behalf of the medical examiner's office. So what she says is the official word of the medical examiner's office. And they did confirm that they were building a morgue. But I was skeptical of the New York Post because they had the wrong address. And why didn't they just say that the New York Medical Examiner's Office says this is happening? They had a weird article where they were saying that it appeared that they were building a morgue. And I didn't know that news was intended to be disseminated on the basis of assumptions, guesses, and possible appearances. I'm a little bit more interested in, they seem to be setting up a temporary morgue. I mean, this word seem to be, that phrase indicates that there's some doubt. So I wanted to dispel the doubt. And David, I'm inspired by a very good British friend of mine who likes to take a theory and then ground truth it, go over there and see what's actually happening on the ground. And it slightly differs from the artificial reality, in this case being created by the New York Post, which would tend to foment panic. Because the other detail that the medical examiner's office shared with me was that this was not an emergency response that was decided upon on the basis of massive deaths. This is a standard procedural precaution that they would do under any circumstance, whether there were a large number of deaths or not, on the basis of the governor announcing a state of emergency in the state of New York and the city of Manhattan. So it's far less exciting when you know that this is a standard procedure which may remain empty. There were lots of ambulances all around New York City and no indication that the hospitals were filled. I would also like to let people know that any statement that a hospital morgue is full, it's not the same as the city morgue being full. The other thing the medical examiner told me is that hospital morgues are very small and hospitals don't generally store dead people for a large length of time. So saying that any particular hospital morgue is full doesn't really give us the full picture. If the New York City Medical Examiner's morgue was full, then you would have a lot of dead people.
Well, this is so fascinating because I've used this word template frequently, and some people argue with it as a good term. But a template is a method of reproducing a given procedure with some degree of accuracy. But you can adjust the template. In machining, of course, you have a template and you have a wheel that tracks over the template and then drives the bit of a machine that maybe turns off a turbine blade. I worked briefly at Parsons Marine Turbines up in Newcastle and watched these things. It's a bit of basic. Now, in software terms, or let's say game theory, you might have a template for the game, and then the basic rules of the game are to follow the template, but you can improvise within the context of the template, particularly in terms of, we remember that famous phrase, generation of television signals.
Right.
So we have the BBC patent for a spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals that was filed as a patent, I believe, in the 3rd of August of 1998, 4 days before my birthday, and 4 days before the attack on the United States embassies in East Africa, which was synchronized in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. So you and I have been following the theory or the possibility that there is a criminal organization around the world that's using, wittingly or unwittingly, the BBC services to transmit live action role play where the public is tricked into believing one thing is true but not given the opportunities to ground truth the data coming from the crime scene or the live action role play. So what I'm going to be dinging on Sir David Clementi is, as the chairman of the BBC board, I am at the moment asking politely for him to consider bringing back Greg Dyke as a second term Director General. And of course, it could be anyone, but the present, I think, Tony Hale or whatever, is resigning. So there's going to be an opening that is offers someone an opportunity. And I happen, because I'm a friend of Greg Dyke and I recognize his qualities, he's a bulldozer and he makes things happen, right? And when he resigned in 2004, a lot of people within the BBC, who I have reason to believe are very professional and very capable, they didn't riot outside, but they demonstrated outside Broadcasting House, where you and I were in January, saying, bring back Greg. So from my understanding of the man, he makes things happen, and engineers like to make things happen. It would be extremely powerful if his staff or former staff came in behind him. But wouldn't that be an extraordinary program? And I've copyrighted the name, or taken the liberty of copywriting the name, to have a sequel to Contagion ! And call it Contagion 201 for obvious reasons, and do some documentaries with the template that I've designed, which has 10 patents in it, right? Clip that into the existing production capability of the BBC. So BBC studios offices around the world could provide a local ground truthing service. So there is a BBC studios in New York where, in fact, you could use the people within New York to provide you with the empirical data needed to ground truth the theories being pumped out by BBC. Now, wouldn't that be a service? And if we discovered that the BBC studios was actually generating models based on a patient zero, when in fact it was a small group of vaccinated convicts that were being vectored into a target community to scare the hell out of the local people and kill significant numbers, such that, let's say hypothetically, the Chinese were told, well, it's Wuhan City now, but it can be Shanghai tomorrow. So just get in behind this carbon dioxide racket and pay your protection money. Over to you.
David, we're just about to transition over to our sponsor exclusive show on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. It's so important that viewers become sponsors so that we can keep the show going and not be beholden to the same kind of corporate sponsorship that things like the New York Times and CNN, MSNBC, Fox, the Washington Post, all of these things have big money. In the case of the Washington Post, it's Jeff Bezos. We're going to talk about how Amazon shareholders are SERCO shareholders, and there's this corporatocracy, this iron grip of money around the information. By offering this show to our viewer sponsors that they pay for, they're guaranteed that we don't have outside influence from undue financial, sponsorship that would cause us to change our reporting. Before we go though, David, we got an excellent question here from Rufino Garcia. He's watching us on YouTube, and he asks if it's true that Nortel is now the Chinese firm Huawei. Have you heard that? Is that true?
I think not. I think if I can quickly talk about Nortel, Nortel entered into an installation agreement with companies like AMEC and Bovis in July of 2001. Nortel in 1991 bought Standard Telephone and Cables patent pool, which includes fiber optics. And a company called McDonald Detwiler in Richmond integrated Nortel's networks for fiber optic and wireless and data. And then when Nortel was driven into bankruptcy, all of its patents, which is the heart of Nortel, migrated south of the border. One lot went, I believe, to Apple, and another lot to Microsoft. And if you look at the Microsoft shareholders, you've got BlackRock again. So effectively, Nortel turned into a phantom, and I use that word purposely, a phantom secure. And I believe the Nortel communications network, right, of fiber optics, wireless, and data was transformed into a criminal organization run by Phantom Secure out of Richmond, British Columbia. Over to you.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's amazing, David. You know, we're going to be digging into all of this stuff when we get over to the sponsor exclusive show. We're gonna cut out now and let people have some time to join us on Subscribestar and Patreon. Was there anything you wanted to touch on quickly before we do that?
I think BBC Studios offers a great opportunity for the world to ground test the theory of pandemics driven by patient zeros. Over to you.
Yeah, we'll be getting into all that. Well, David, thank you for this preview show, and people can join us on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thanks for watching, everybody. We hope to see you there. Have a great day.